listen what this young man has become. Please welcome Justin Olson.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here this evening. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here with you and to share a few minutes of your time this evening on a hot summer night. I know there's lots of things that you could be doing, but I'm just thrilled that you've chosen to come here and to educate yourselves about the candidates and about the issues that we have before us in this important election before us this election cycle. As Dan mentioned, my name's Justin Olson. I'm running for Congress. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm running for Congress, a little bit about my past, who I am, and then a little bit about what I've been able to accomplish in my time in the legislature. But most importantly, I want to tell you about what I hope to do as your representative in Congress. Now, I'm running for Congress because I'm concerned, as I'm sure most of us are, about the future that we face. Now, I'm concerned when I look to the national debt. We had a $10 trillion debt when President Obama took office. That debt has nearly doubled to almost $20 trillion. It's an unsustainable problem that our country is not addressing. We're on a fiscal crisis. We are on a path to fiscal bankruptcy, and that's something that concerns me, and I'm sure that it concerns each of us, or we wouldn't be here today to discuss these issues. That's why I'm running for Congress. I think that we've got to change course. We've got to reduce the out-of-control spending in Washington, D.C. We've got to reduce the size and the cost and the reach of the federal government. We've got to change our path so that we can pass on a country to our kids and our grandkids that's a country that's strong and free and full of economic opportunity and a bright prosperity and hope for the future. And that's the future that I want to pass on to our children. I'm sure that that's the future that each of you hope that your children and grandchildren will inherit as well. And that's why I'm running for Congress. As Dan mentioned, I ran for the state legislature in 2010. So you guys can think back to the time we had a $3.6 billion budget crisis that the state was facing. It was an uncertain time. We had the stock market crash, the credit crunch. People were uneasy about what the future looked like for the economy. Most of us knew someone personally that lost a job. Most of us were impacted in some way by the Great Recession. And the government was not exempt from the impacts of the downturn in the economy. And what we saw was a significant decrease in tax revenues. We, for many times, for many years, leading up to the credit crisis, we saw significant increases in tax revenues. But in addition to those increases in tax revenues, we saw an unsustainable growth in spending. In the years leading up to the budget crisis, the state budget grew by more than double the rate of growth in population and inflation. So the state was ill-prepared to be able to absorb the shock of the downturn in the economic cycle. So when all of a sudden we weren't seeing double-digit increases in sales tax collections and income tax collections and property tax collections, and instead we saw significant declines years in a row, that led to this $3.6 billion budget deficit. At the time, as Dan mentioned, I was working in the Arizona Tax Research Association. I was analyzing the state budget. I was providing budget proposals, recommendations. How could we address the fiscal situation that the state found itself in? And I was frustrated when I looked to our state legislators and leaders under the leadership of Governor Napolitano at the time, when they did not do what needed to be done. We needed to address the fiscal crisis. We needed to react to the new information that we had given the new circumstances of the downturn in the economic cycle. And what did the legislature do at that time? Well, instead of adjusting spending and reducing spending to a reasonable and a sustainable level, you all remember what happened. Well, we saw a record property tax increase in 2008. In 2010, the legislature referred out a record sales tax increase. And then we also saw significant increases in debt. Now, who knows what the constitutional debt limit is in our state constitution? I'm sure there's a few of us in here, Gene and Rustin. and Gene Defoe. We got two Genes here that know. So Rustin, what is the constitutional debt limit? It's not zero in the state constitution. Gene?
I'm not sure.
350,000.
350 million? She said 350,000. $350,000. That's our debt limit in the state constitution. Now, how many of us think that we actually have only $350,000 of state debt? Well, we don't. And the way that the state has gotten around that is they've really ignored that debt limit in the Constitution. What they've done is they've entered into long-term debt contracts. You remember the state sold the Capitol, they sold other state buildings, and we're leasing those buildings back on a long-term debt instrument for 20 years. We got the revenue from that sale, we spent that on the salaries and benefits of that fiscal year, and now we're paying the debt on that for many years to come. So we saw a significant increase in state debt. We also saw a significant increase in budget gimmicks. Who remembers the budget rollover? All right, Rustin, tell us what is the budget rollover.
If I'm not mistaken, education's the largest portion of the state budget. And the education budget goes from July to June. And what they were doing is they would get there and they weren't making their numbers, so they would throw June's on to the next year and start the following year a month in the hole on the largest portion of the budget. I'm sure they were doing that with a lot of other gimmicks. We say kicking the can down the road, but I think we need to understand more of the specifics to understand really what that means. Anyway,
That's
just
exactly
you're shooting yourself in the foot for the following year.
That's exactly right. So this is another budget gimmick, another way to pretend like the budget was balanced, because there is a constitutional requirement that the budget in the fiscal year be balanced on a cash basis, but it was not balanced on a structural and an actual basis. And this was another method that was turned to. And so you had $1.3 billion in expenses of the current fiscal year that were not paid until the first day of the next fiscal year. Now, the schools actually spent the money in the current fiscal year, and then they were reimbursed on the first day of the next fiscal year. So it really was not a balanced budget. It was a budget gimmick that then pushed the expense into the next fiscal year. And then that next fiscal year, you would have to do that gimmick again in order to not have $1.3 billion of new expenses in that fiscal year. So these are the methods that were being turned to by the state at the time. $1.3 billion in debt, or in budget gimmicks, a significant increase in debt, and a $1 billion sales tax increase, a $250 million property tax increase, and the budget still was not balanced. So I ran on a platform and said, look, we've got to address the fiscal situation that the state faces, and we've got to do it in a sustainable way. We've got to structurally balance the budget. We have a new circumstance. The state's not as wealthy as the state thought it was in 2008 because of these new realities. The economy has turned down. There's not as much sales tax collection, and there's not as many income tax revenues coming into the state. And so we've got to adjust. We've got to make the difficult decisions that each of us had to make in our own lives, in our families' lives, in our small businesses. We have to adjust to the new reality. We had to make those difficult decisions and balance our budget. So I ran on a platform of balancing the budget and doing it with no new taxes, no new budget gimmicks, and no new debt. I was very excited that I got down to the legislature and I got involved and made the budget my priority, began to really get involved in the budget, became the budget leader in the House, and I'm very honored that we've been able to deliver on that promise. I've been able to deliver on that promise that I made to balance the budget and to do it with no new taxes and no new budget gimmicks and no new debt. So now we've turned that unprecedented $3.6 billion budget deficit into a budget surplus. So you'll remember that last year we addressed the last remaining piece of the budget deficit. And actually, I think it was about a year ago I came and addressed this gathering. Some of you, I'm sure, were in this room. And when we talked about that last step that we took last year, when we made a 2.2% reduction in total spending statewide about a year and a half ago. And that was to eliminate that last remaining piece of that $3.6 billion unprecedented budget deficit. And now we have a structurally balanced budget And we're in a situation where the state can now grow and address the priorities of the state in a sustainable way, because we solved the problem and we did it without papering over the problem and just having to come back again the next year to look for new budget gimmicks to balance the budget. So I'm very pleased with those accomplishments. Now, as Dan mentioned, I was very honored to have the support of my colleagues in the House of Representatives who were going to elect me to be the Speaker of the House in the next session, because of that leadership that I've shown at the state level in solving the budget deficit, and being a leader on tax policy, and being a leader on the right to life and traditional family values and the Second Amendment, being a leader on securing our borders. But what I saw just a couple months ago was that Matt Salmon announced that he's not running for re-election to Congress. And my wife and I gave it a significant amount of thought and prayer, and we felt like that this is the right decision for us to pursue at this time. It's the right decision for our country, it's the right decision for our district, and it's also the right decision for our family. For me to run for Congress, and the reason that I'm running for Congress is to do that same thing that I've done at the state level, to be a voice for balancing our budget. Now, the problem in Congress is orders of magnitude greater than the problems that we faced at the state level. But it's the same issue. We've got to live within our means. And it's so much more critical that we address the problem, and we address it quickly and decisively. Because if we don't, we're going to lose the future. Now, I don't want to sound over-dramatic in that statement, but we cannot underemphasize how critical it is that we address our spending problem in Washington, D.C. I already mentioned that the debt has more than doubled in just the last 8 years. We're reaching a tipping point, and we know where this path leads. We can look to Argentina of 10 years ago. We can look to Greece of 3 to 6 years ago. This path is an unsustainable path, and it's a path that leads to a country that's not the country that we grew up in, this country that's strong and free and has an economy that is full of opportunity to grow and to move into new positions and new ways of new careers, and to search out new ways of life. If we don't address this problem, then we're going to be passing on a country that is burdened with an unsustainable debt to our kids and our grandkids. And that's why I'm running for Congress. We've got to address that deficit. Now, in addition to that, I've also been a leader on many different issues. I mentioned the right to life. Now, this is something that I feel very, very passionately about. I feel like that it is absolutely critical that we, the people, and our representatives at every level of the government, stand up and protect the most innocent among us. That we are advocates for the right to life. It's in our founding documents that these are our unalienable rights for which our governments are established to protect and defend the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must be strong advocates for the right to life, and that's what I've done in the state legislature. In 2012, I introduced a bill that was signed by Governor Brewer. And this was a bill that was modeled after what the members of Congress and the House of Representatives passed, that then ultimately died in Harry Reid's Senate at the time. And it was a bill that said, we're not going to spend your hard-earned tax dollars on organizations that provide abortions, such as Planned Parenthood. That bill passed out of the House of Representatives, and it died in a desk in Harry Reid's drawer. So after that, a lot of folks across the country and state legislatures said, well, we can pass this here in our own state. I introduced that bill in Arizona in 2012. I got the support of my colleagues in the House of Representatives. We passed that out of the House of Representatives. We passed it out of the Senate, and Governor Brewer signed that bill. And I was very honored to be able to have been the advocate and the person leading the charge in protecting your tax dollars from not funding something that I would venture to say everyone in this room finds morally reprehensible. I was very honored that we were successful in passing that bill, and immediately upon passage of that bill, as expected, Planned Parenthood and the Obama administration sued. And we fought the Obama administration, we fought Planned Parenthood in court. We fought it all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and everybody that knows the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals knows that it's a very liberal court. And unfortunately, the Ninth Circuit sided with Planned Parenthood and sided with the Obama administration. We appealed up to the Supreme Court, but unfortunately the Supreme Court did not take up the case. And so we lost that case. And so what I did is I didn't just give up and say, okay, well, the Supreme Court has determined that this is unconstitutional. The Ninth Circuit has determined that. The Supreme Court's decided they're not going to overturn that. So we're just going to give up. We're going to give up the fight. We're going to pursue other issues. No, last year I came back and I found a different approach, a new way that we can protect you from not having to fund something that you find morally wrong. So this year I introduced a bill that said it followed a precedent that's already been established, and that is that the federal government already says that if you're a participant in these healthcare programs, such as those that the state provides that we're trying to not fund to providers of abortion. If you're a participant in these programs, you have to follow the law. And if you don't follow the law, then we can exclude you from these programs. And there's a certain protocol that they must follow. And the current administrations prior to the current administration have used this. And if you submit fraudulent claims to Medicare or some other program, then you can be excluded from being a provider in that program. And you can no longer receive those tax dollars by being a participant in that program. So we use this precedent that's already been established. And we said, well, it's already the law. It's already federal law that you cannot use tax dollars to directly fund an abortion. But there's no way to enforce that law. So what we did was I introduced a bill this session, that said, in Arizona, if you provide abortions and you receive tax dollars, you need to account for your tax dollars and all of the dollars that you spend on abortion and show that all of your dollars that are spent on abortion are privately raised and they are not your tax dollars. And you've got to distinguish between your tax dollars and your privately funded dollars, and not only the amounts that are directly spent on abortion, but also the overhead. So you cannot we're also going to prohibit indirectly funding abortion through using your tax dollars to provide the overhead that allows you to provide an abortion. So I introduced this bill, and it said that if you don't do this, along with if you don't report incidents of sexual assault, or if you submit fraudulent claims, if you do many of these other fraudulent acts, if you break these laws, and if you don't segregate your tax dollars from the dollars that you use to provide abortion, well, then you can be excluded from being a participant in the state's Medicaid program. I'm very excited about this approach. Now, I was floored when Planned Parenthood came down to the committee that I was testifying in. And they said, we don't use tax dollars to fund abortion, but we oppose this bill. And I stood up and said, if you don't use tax dollars to fund an abortion, then you have nothing to fear from this bill. And the fact that they're opposing this bill tells me that there is something for them to fear. And I'm very excited that this bill passed the House of Representatives. It passed the Senate, and Governor Ducey signed this bill, and it is now law. And we expect to challenge Planned Parenthood and the Obama administration in court again, and I am very optimistic that this bill will hold up to the precedent that's already been established by the current administration. I've been a leader on the right to life. I've not just been someone who's voted for pro-life bills. I've been one who's been actively introducing legislation, actively defending and advocating for the most innocent among us. In addition, I've also been a leader on many other issues. I'd like to speak just briefly about one other bill that I introduced and was successful in passing last year. And this was a bill that you all might remember. It was a bill that said that, well, I'll give you a little bit of the history. So we all know what the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says, right? So what is the Supremacy Clause? What does it do to state laws? Who could give me just a brief synopsis? What is the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution? I know it's too simple of a question.
U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
Exactly. U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if Arizona passes a law that is in direct conflict with the U.S. Constitution, then it's going to be invalidated. Well, the Supremacy Clause, says that the federal laws are supreme to the state laws. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. But there is a precedent that was established by Sheriff Mack. You all remember the Brady bill passed under the Clinton administration. And Sheriff Mack said, this is not constitutional. This is a violation of our Second Amendment rights. It was challenged in court. Supreme Court ruled differently, but he said, I'm not going to spend our tax dollars enforcing a law that I feel is unconstitutional, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so he said, I'm not going to enforce this law. I'm not going to spend our resources enforcing it. If the federal government wants to come here and enforce this law, well then, by all means, the federal government can be my guest and enforce this law. We're not going to do it here. That was challenged by the federal government, as you can imagine. It was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Sheriff Mack and said, you federal government cannot co-opt state and local tax resources to do your bidding. Yeah, the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says that this law is supreme. You cannot overturn that federal law, but the federal government cannot co-opt local resources. Well, we took advantage of that precedent that was established, and we said, I don't feel that Obamacare is constitutional, notwithstanding the Supreme Court ruling that was flawed in my view. The Supreme Court ruling basically said that because the federal government has the authority to tax, and because the penalty for not following Obamacare is a tax, this is within their express constitutional authority. It was a flawed ruling, because following that logic, there are no limits on the federal government. As long as the penalty for not doing what the federal government is requiring you to do is a tax, then all of the limits go away. And so it was a flawed ruling. And I do believe that Obamacare is in fact unconstitutional. So I introduced a bill last year that said, given the fact that Obamacare is unconstitutional, we're not going to spend Arizona tax dollars enforcing Obamacare in our state. And we passed that bill out of the House of Representatives, out of the Senate, and Governor Ducey signed that bill, and that's the law of the land in Arizona today. We're not using your state dollars to enforce Obamacare in Arizona. Now, those are the types of issues that I'm going to pursue as your representative in Congress. I'm going to be a strong advocate for the right to life. I'm going to be a strong advocate for repealing and replacing Obamacare, replacing it with free market-oriented solutions. Obamacare actually drove up the cost of coverage, and it decreased choice. We need to do the reverse. We need to increase choice and drive down the cost, and we can do that through free market-oriented reforms. We can allow individuals to purchase insurance across state lines that will dramatically increase the market, increase the alternatives available to you, and drive down the cost. We could decrease the mandates that we're placing on insurances so there are more options available to you and lower costs. We could have meaningful tort reform that will decrease the costs for all who are purchasing insurance. That's the type of leadership that I will provide for you as your representative in Congress. Now, in addition to just a few of these issues that we've talked about, I've also been a leader on tax policy. In my private sector job, now I've served as a citizen legislator. That means that I have a career outside of politics, and that was really the design of our state legislature, that folks would come out of the private sector and continue to work in the private sector and dedicate time on the side as state representatives, as citizen legislators. That's what I've done as I've represented you in the state legislature. I've worked full-time as a tax analyst and really understand tax policy. I got an MBA in finance from ASU, and that's something that is near and dear to my heart, is making sure that we have a tax policy in place that's favorable to the taxpayer. It's favorable to you. It's favorable to individuals. It's favorable to businesses. And it's favorable to the economy, so we can grow our economy, increase the jobs and opportunities available to Arizonans, and increase the economic activity that benefits all of us that are participants in the economy by decreasing the costs of goods and services, increasing the returns on our retirements and on our investments, and increasing our wages and job opportunities. So I've been a tax cutter. I've been a leader on that issue. In 2011, I was a strong proponent of a bill that we passed at the state legislature that was a 20% reduction in corporate income tax and a 10% reduction in business property tax. And we passed this bill because you remember in 2011, we had a 10% unemployment rate. So we addressed these tax rates that were job-killing tax rates. We reduced the burden that the economy, that the government was placing on the economy by reducing the tax burden, reducing the regulatory burden, so we could get government out of the way and allow the economy to grow, so we could get Arizonans back to work. And I'm very excited that we had the desired impact of that effort. Forbes magazine actually ranked Arizona #1 in the country for the last 2 years in a row for projected job creation for the coming year. We've actually been in the top 10 for actual job creation for many years in a row, and that's a direct result of the reforms that we passed in 2011 by getting government out of the way and allowing the private sector to flourish, allowing Arizonans to get back to work. That unemployment rate fell from 10% down to 6%. Had that desired impact, and that's been an issue that I've been a leader on. I've been a driving advocate for reducing the burden that government is placing on the economy and on our household budgets, and decreasing the regulatory burden that we're placing on the economy as well. So just want to wrap up with a couple thoughts, and then most importantly, I want to get to your questions. I want to talk to you about what issues are important to you. So be thinking about what you would like to ask me about how I would approach any particular issue in Washington, and we'll address those issues that are most important to you. But I want to leave you with just one thought. And that is, well, let's see, let's talk about one topic, and then we'll get to my closing thought. One thought about the Constitution. And that is, I want to share with you a quote from Daniel Webster in 1800. I'm sure somebody might be able to think of what I'm going to quote. Does anybody want to venture a guess what Daniel Webster said about the Constitution? He said, "Hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands. For miracles do not cluster, and that which has happened once in 6,000 years might not happen again. So hold on to the Constitution. For should the United States Constitution fail, there will be tyranny throughout the land." Now, I'm running for Congress because I do have a deep love for the Constitution. I feel that we have turned away from the original intent of the Constitution with many different changes to the Constitution through Supreme Court rulings, through amendments that were referred out by the Congress and ratified by the states. We've gone away from the limited government that our founding fathers anticipated the federal government to be. Now, I've been an advocate for using the method that our founding fathers put into the Constitution to try and get the federal government back into that limited scope that was originally expected for it to have. Now, I do believe that our Constitution was divinely inspired. I do believe that our founding fathers were raised up for that purpose of putting forward the Constitution that established freedoms in our country and actually established freedoms throughout the world as those principles were exported to many other countries who mirrored those principles and established those freedoms in their own land. But those freedoms have been trampled upon. The limits placed on our federal government have been eradicated, and to say that they've been crossed over is an understatement. And we've got to get the federal government back into the limits that were anticipated under the Constitution as it was originally interpreted and originally inspired and written down by our founding fathers. Now, our founding fathers put into the Constitution, they had the foresight to say that at some point there may need to be a change to the Constitution to clarify something that's not being followed And there may be a change that Washington doesn't want. And we cannot count on Washington to refer out an amendment to the Constitution to get that change that's needed to clarify the Constitution, to get the federal government back into those limits that we anticipate it to be within. And so our Founding Fathers put into the Constitution an amendment process. We're all familiar with the process where Congress refers out an amendment. 2/3 of Congress can vote on an amendment, and 3/4 of the states can ratify it. That's happened, what, 27 times?
Yeah.
27 times we've amended the Constitution through that process. How many times have we amended the Constitution through the Supreme Court reinterpreting what was originally written in the Constitution? Countless times. Countless times. How many times have we used the third process that's expressly written into the Constitution to limit the federal government?
No. Zero.
Never. Never. I introduced a bill in 2011, my first year in the state legislature, that said we've got to get spending in Washington under control, and we cannot count on Congress, we cannot count on Washington to limit its own authority, to refer out a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, notwithstanding the fact that a balanced budget amendment is overwhelmingly supported by the people of the United States. We can't count on Washington to do it, but we can count on the states, and that's why the Founding Fathers put into the Constitution a method for the states to limit the authority of Washington. So I introduced a bill in 2011 that was a call that said we're going to call for a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution through an amendments convention of the states. And I've been a strong supporter of that method to try and get the federal government back to those limits that were originally expected for it to live within. So these are some of the things that have been priorities. These are my record. This is what I've focused on at the state legislature. And as we get into the question and answer section, perhaps you might have some questions about how does my record compare to those that are running also for this open seat. I'd be happy to address those questions. But I want to leave you with one closing thought before we get to our questions. And that is, as we look to the challenges that we face as a country, I mentioned the debt doubling in just 8 years. You know, the director of the FBI itemizes all of the things that a former Secretary of State did wrong in breaking the law and says, we're not going to prosecute her. Notwithstanding the fact that if somebody else does this in these same circumstances, that doesn't mean that they might not be prosecuted. We're violating the rule of law. We have not secured our borders. The list goes on, and there are many reasons to be concerned about the future for our country. And those concerns remind me of something that Ronald Reagan said. Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We do not pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, defended, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. I'm running for Congress because I believe fervently that these principles of freedom that are established in our Constitution must be defended, and they must be protected. And I'm running for Congress to be in that fight, be in that arena with all my passion and motivation and drive and endurance. And I will see that fight through to the end. And that is the commitment that I make to you. I will be your voice. I will be your voice for your conservative principles in Washington if I'm so honored to get your support. My name's Justin Olson, and I would love to have your support on Election Day.
All right.
Now we'll open it up to questions. I see a few hands here. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you say you want to deal with freedom and taxes. How about having an amendment to the Constitution to ban the 16th Amendment and bring back and take away the Marxist progressive income tax, which is what it is. It was stolen from Adam Smith by Karl Marx, and we don't need it in America. Why don't we be taxed without representation? So let's get rid of that.
Excellent, excellent question. When it comes to tax reform, I wholeheartedly support tax reform. We've got to do everything that we can to reduce our tax burden. If we can repeal the constitutional authority for an income tax, absolutely I'd be supportive of that. We've got to reduce the tax burden across the board, particularly with the income tax. When it comes to the income tax, did you guys know that we actually have the highest corporate income tax rate of the developed world? 35%. It's a job-killing tax rate. What are corporations doing?
Leaving
Well,
America.
they're producing overseas because they don't want to be subject to this job-killing tax rate. They produce overseas, and if they repatriate those dollars, then they're subject to that tax rate. So they actually leave those resources overseas. If we had tax reform, if we lowered that rate, broadened the base, and we would actually see a significant increase in economic opportunity because those resources would be back in our country, growing our economy, creating jobs for Arizonans, and creating economic opportunities for each of us. So I absolutely support tax reform in all of the different ways that we can approach it. Constitutional amendment would be great. The likelihood of that happening in the near future, I'm not overly optimistic that it's going to happen. I'd be supportive if we can have that occur. But in addition to efforts to repeal that amendment and repeal that constitutional authority, we've got to be working to reduce that rate every chance we get. So I think I saw you, and then we'll go back here. No, it was you, someone sitting next to you. Okay.
You know, I'm sure you've seen Water's World on O'Reilly and some of these intelligent people that he interviews. You say that you want to do away with the burden of unsustainable debt. If you go out on the street and talk about unsustainable debt to these people that are walking around here, they aren't going to know what the hell you're talking about. Is there another way we can get this through to people? What does it mean? I mean, we've got all these guys voting for Bernie because they don't have a clue what this would be.
All I hear is free.
No, you're absolutely right.
Is there another way we can work this?
Okay, I'll restate the question. So he said, we talked about debt reduction, but you talk to anybody,
Why don't you come over here?
anybody on the street and they don't understand the problem. Am I accurately summarizing?
Yeah, exactly so.
And
as
so
long
folks
as I
want
get
new
free
stuff
school
or
bus.
free stuff. Yeah, so because they don't understand that we have this problem. And I think you're absolutely right, that's the fundamental problem, and that's why our politicians have gotten us into this mess. It's not rocket science that we have a problem and it needs to be addressed, but what happens is it's politically popular to give away free stuff, and it's not politically popular to pay for it. And so we continue to in-debt the future. And he's dying to say something, so I'll wrap this up real quick and we'll get to him. So, is it right on that topic?
What I'm looking at is your closing statement and what Itasca Small was saying, and the fact that, and he's saying it too, education. What are you going to do to kill the Department of Education?
Excellent point. Excellent question. So first of all, on his question, then I'll get to yours, educating winning the hearts and minds of the American people. That's what we have to do. We're not going to change government. We're not going to change Washington until we win the hearts and minds of the American people. Now, about half of America wants Hillary Clinton to be President of the United States. Now, that's notwithstanding the fact that she's clearly violated the law, you know, and so there is that is the issue that has to be addressed, just like Mr. Landvatter mentioned earlier on, and that is that politics is downstream from culture. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to elect the right people. That's critical to make sure that we are sending people into public office that are going to do the right thing, but we can't count on the voters that don't live in our district to also do that if they have a different perspective. And so we have to do everything that we can in every arena, every sphere of influence that we have to try and win the hearts and minds of the American people by teaching about why these principles that our country was founded on are so critical. Why is limited federal government good for Americans? We've got to do everything that we can. And how do we do that? Well, it's not just being involved in public policy, being involved in politics. That's a critical component. It's coaching your neighborhood soccer team, being a mentor to the rising generation, looking for every opportunity that you have to be a voice for conservative principles and educating folks, using your talents of expression. Maybe you have the ability to sing or to perform, and you use those talents of expression to be able to express these principles, and that's what we have to do.
We don't have 100 years.
We don't have 100 years, but which reminds me of another important point. You know, just last Sunday I was showing my kids Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Wanted to teach them some important principles. And what is the line that he says in there? He says, the lost causes. The lost causes. What does he say about lost causes? He said, most of the times the lost causes are the only ones worth fighting for. So many times it can feel like balancing our budget, getting the federal government back to the limited nature that our founding fathers anticipated is a lost cause, that we're not going to be able to effectuate that change. But we don't stop fighting. We do everything within our power, and we continue to work, because at some point we're going to have the crisis. We're going to be compelled to recognize that we can't afford all of the debt that we've accrued. And how difficult is it going to be when we get to that crisis? That's the question. The sooner we address it, the less difficult it will be. All right, so now to your question, education. I think that the federal government does not have a role in establishing education policy. I've been an opponent to the Common Core, and I think that we should repeal the Department of Education, along with many other departments at the federal level. There are countless different things that the federal government is doing that it doesn't have the express authority to do in the Constitution. It should get back to the enumerated powers that are within the Constitution. I see so many questions. I'm going to try and be briefer in my responses so I can get to more of you. Yeah, go ahead.
Congress has a very low approval rating. I think it's like 8%.
Right.
And for various reasons. One of the things that we got Obamacare passed by, in large part, by a group of Congress individuals that lost their elections. Okay, it was the lame duck session. Would you be willing to pass a bill or champion a cause to write a bill that says when you lose your election, you have no vote. You need to spend that time cleaning out your desk.
I think that's a great idea.
And will you go knock on door after door, gaining a coalition for your cause?
No, I think that's a great idea. And it reminds me of the phrase, I forget who said it. It's going to come to me when I'm driving home, I'm sure. But there was a phrase that says, you know, your pocketbook's never at more risk than when the legislature is in session. You know, that's certainly the case with Congress. The Congress that legislates the least is the Congress that is doing the least harm to our freedoms. So I think any way that we can limit the bills that Congress is passing, I think that's a perfect example. When you are a lame duck Congress, that would be a great idea, to limit that authority that you have.
If you've lost your election, right, the people have already spoken, you're done.
I think it's a great idea.
Will Rogers.
Will Rogers. Yeah, thank you. All right, we'll go here.
How about?
We'll go over here real quick, and then I saw your hand as well.
Would you be in favor of, and I know this is a long shot, the person that gets elected in the next presidential election coming out and throwing out every law that has been enacted without going through the Congress?
Absolutely. I think that there's a great vehicle to do that. I've been a strong supporter and an advocate of the REINS Act. What the REINS Act would do is it says that, you know, Congress is, and the federal government has got it upside down. The Constitution says that the authority to legislate rests with Congress, and it shall not be delegated. And what does Congress do? Well, they write bills like Obamacare and say, well, we've got to pass it to know what's in it, because it hasn't been written yet. It's broad guidelines that the agencies then fill in. The agencies are the ones that are writing the laws through regulation, and that's absolutely unconstitutional, and Congress has abdicated its responsibility. Congress needs to step up. Congress needs to be accountable for its role in legislating and its role in providing oversight, and it's abdicated its responsibility in both.
If you were to do what he said, you're talking 95% of the laws.
Absolutely. I mean, how much has Obama enacted through his executive order that were absolutely unconstitutional?
Over the last 50 years.
All of the agencies, what the REINS Act would do is it would say that right now the way that it works is the agency promulgates a rule, they issue it into the Federal Register. If Congress doesn't vote it down and say we're not going to allow this rule to become a rule and have the force of law, then it then becomes a rule and it has the force of law. The REINS Act would say that it does not become a rule unless Congress votes on it affirmatively, follows the Constitution, and does not delegate that responsibility to legislate. Then it would become a law. And I would agree, 100%. Overturn everything and say we've got to pass everything through Congress. So we'll go, was that a follow-up question on that one? We'll go here, 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 and then.
I was curious because there's several people running against you.
Yeah.
Which ones are being supported and backed by the Chamber of Commerce, which to me is anti-American now. Used to not be, but they certainly are now.
Are
They're
you
for the open
supported by the
borders.
Chamber of Commerce?
They're for open borders and
No, that's a great question. I've not seen any endorsements by the Chambers of Commerce
Okay.
yet. I don't know if there
Okay,
will be
maybe-
later on,
Tanny,
but I've not seen any yet,
Okay.
right? So I think we're going here, here, and then there. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. We all know, those of us here, that over the last generations, that the population has been dumbed down. And everything has been done very systematically and carefully to take out all the, and then we have entertainment that takes over people's minds and they do nothing else. But so we need to gather as much of a community of people as we can possibly muster to realize what's going on and to get this kind of education and wake up.
Absolutely. It's talking to our friends and our neighbors. It's, getting involved, and you can become a precinct committeeman in the party. You can talk to your neighbors and have meet and greets at your house and have folks come in and learn about these issues. And you had a question?
Well, not so much maybe a question, but more of a comment or suggestion or whatever. I would think that you should
I need an editor.
campaign with other Republicans, especially our nominee and whoever he chooses as a running mate, and try to get a businessman in there instead of a corrupt politician.
I agree completely. I think we've got to unify behind our nominee. The risks are far too great.
Do you feel strongly
You
about
look
that?
at we already have a vacancy on the Supreme Court with Justice Scalia, and that vacancy leaves a hole that was filled by a strict constructionist, a constitutionalist. We're guaranteed to replace Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. If Hillary Clinton's the next president, we're guaranteed to change the ideological makeup of the court for generations to come, and we've lost the future.
Maybe, but also we may have the first impeached and convicted president because she is a corrupt liar and criminal.
Justin.
First of all, if you could speak to differences between you and, quite frankly, most of the informed conservatives, it's going to be between Justin and Andy Biggs.
right.
Okay, Don Stapley and Christine Jones, if you're thinking about them, come talk to me. But Andy Biggs, we know, would not do an Article 5 constitutional convention, which you hinted to, but you also recently voted for a social program called Kitty Care, right? Can you speak to that?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are differences between us. I mentioned, my support for Article 5, the amendments process, and I think that this is a big difference, and it matters, and it's something that I think is critical. We've got to reform Washington, and we cannot count on Washington to restrict its own authority.
I think that's one of the only chinks that Biggs has.
Yeah, and
what else? What else?
So, but I think that it's critical that we recognize that elevating. So Rustin understands that Biggs has opposed Article 5, and perhaps everyone here knows that. But so I was a strong proponent of using the Article 5 amendments process in the Constitution that our founding fathers put into the Constitution to limit the federal government. That's something that my opponent in this race has been adamantly opposed to. And so that is a key difference between the two of us. And right now, the folks that I think you guys hear from Shane, drawing a blank on the Article 5, the Compact for America. Nick Dranius, I believe, has come and spoken to this group before. I've heard him down here a few times. There are, I was speaking to Nick Dranius, and he's done a lot of work in trying to use this amendments process to limit the federal government. And he's acknowledged that they don't have an outspoken, ardent opponent in Congress right now. And having an outspoken, ardent opponent in Congress will be a significant obstacle to that effort, to try and use the Article 5 amendments process to rein in the federal government. So that is a key difference between Andy and I.
He did write a book on it. Like, it wasn't just a shallow thing. He's written an entire book on it called The Con of the Con. But anyway, go ahead.
No, his opposition to it is very well established, very well established, right there. So so that's a key difference between the two of us. Rustin mentioned kids care. So this was a bill that I did support. I wanted to make sure that this bill was going through and it was going to pass with or without me. And I wanted to make sure that we restricted the exposure to the state and ensured that the state would not be on the hook under this program if the federal government stopped funding the program. So what we have right now is our tax dollars are funding this program, and it's benefiting low-income kids all across the country and every other state but ours. And I will be an advocate in Washington for reducing the program in its entirety. And I think that that's a good strategy to say we've got to reduce all spending, and this program included, but we've got to do it at a federal level so that we are actually saving tax dollars for Arizona and reducing the deficit so that we can balance our budget.
But is it limited to poverty, or does it also go above the poverty level?
It's the working force. I believe it's between 100 and 200% of the poverty level.
But to clarify it even further, isn't that Arizona, your tax dollars are sitting back in Washington, D.C. that are just sitting there? And if Arizona didn't take it for this 3 years, your tax dollars would just be sitting there and they would go elsewhere. So this was one way to ensure that money we've already given to the federal government comes back to the state of Arizona and is used here exclusively.
Right.
It sounds like a cousin to the Medicaid expansion.
It's very different. I was a very ardent opponent to the Medicaid expansion.
Right, I know you were. But there's other Republicans. Your senator, right? Your state senator that championed it. I mean, he was behind it all the way, saying, "Oh well, they're federal dollars that we're going to lose out on," right?
Right. So the difference.
Worsley, Bob Worsley.
That's what I thought.
Right. So what we were doing with the Medicaid expansion is we actually were in the process of establishing federal policy, and that was something that I fought diligently to stop that growth of spending at the federal level, and that's something that I will advocate for in Congress as well. We've got to reduce the spending. We've got to lower the debt so that we aren't passing on a bankrupt country to our kids and our grandkids. All right, I saw Joe back there.
Yes, thank you. The East Valley Pro-Life Alliance, I want to thank you for what you've done for the pro-life movement. But I just need a yes or no answer on this. The Supreme Court looks like it's going to have more of a conservative look, especially if somebody gets involved as a president. I heard one of the ladies is going to leave. Would you create a bill that would come up with a bill that would create a pathway to overturning Roe versus Wade, and do you think it can be done?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's my faith and my optimism is that at some point in my lifetime, in our lifetime, we will see.
I'm running out of years.
The right to life protected. Hopefully in your lifetime, Joe. Hopefully. All right.
Shane. Get Shane in the back.
I would like to see all laws that have pushed through Congress. One of them talks about stupid kids.
Sorry?
They don't pass a law that would refer to stupid kids. You get them, you do what you have to with them, but you don't ever say you're here because you're stupid. We have somebody at the top of our government that says, hey, you're all stupid. I'm the only one that's got the cute smile that everybody loves. We all get enough.
What's the question?
I'm not hearing you that well, so
What's the question is we don't need people at the top of the government saying, we're going to put all this money in this hand of these people and make them smarter because we're going to lift them up because they're stupid. Because first we spend many, many hours telling them they're stupid, and then we give them all this money and we wonder why they never do anything. That's good.
Thanks. Excellent comment. Shane?
Justin, number one, I want to thank you for coming. You're a powerful speaker, and we really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
I just want to bring up what I think is the head of the state, and I want to understand how you'll deal with this. And I think this is an issue that most Americans are in denial of or simply don't understand, and that's the issue that's going on with the Federal Reserve. The founders put a mechanism in place to prevent entities like the Federal Reserve from coming into existence and doing what they're doing to the American people today. In fact, Thomas Jefferson warned us that the banking system is more dangerous than even standing armies. And yet we have a Federal Reserve that's been operating for over 100 years now. They manipulate the money supply. And you can talk about any issue that's been brought up tonight. I don't care if it's right to life. I don't care if it's Black Lives Matter. It doesn't matter what issue you're talking about. Attack on religion, attack on free speech. It all comes back to the manipulation of the money supply because he that controls the money wins. He controls the narrative. And now we have this new phenomenon that's come into place in America over the last 25, 30 years, which is the two-income earning households. And we're just accepting it, well, that's just the way it is. No, there's a reason why that is. Because you have a hidden tax called inflation. And they print money, and they print money, and they print money, and it's making it more difficult for the individual to get ahead. So my question, Justin, is I understand why most people don't want to fight this battle, because either they end up dead, JFK, Abraham Lincoln, or they try to kill him, Andrew Jackson. And so I understand why there's reluctance, but we need a voice out there that's going to fight this battle, because until we clean this problem up, the progressives will continue to control the narrative and manipulate the money supply and ultimately control us. So what will you do using the Constitution as your guide to not just saying that you'll do it, but what will you do using the Constitution as your guide to take this issue head on and literally pledge your life to really making things happen here?
Excellent. Very well said. Very well stated.
Your life, your fortune, and
My
your sacred
life,
honor.
fortune, and sacred honor, just like Mr. Landbatter mentioned. You're absolutely right. I agree 100%. I think a first step is auditing the Fed. It's not been audited. We need to open up the books and see exactly what's going on, and that will help us to make the case that this is something that needs to be reformed. And you're absolutely right. The Constitution did not anticipate us printing money. It made it very, very clear that that was not authorized under the Constitution. So I agree, and we need to make sure that we do reform that system. I mean, it's like
reform or abolish.
Well, get back to a system that is constitutional. I mean, when we refer to our monetary policy, it's like what Milton Friedman said. When he was talking about in I believe it was in A Monetary History of the United States, he was talking about how it really was the monetary policy of the Fed that exacerbated the mild recession that turned it into the Great Depression. And he was saying that, well, they should have done it this way, they should have done it that way. And people were saying, so you support the Fed? He said, well, no, I think a better system is the gold standard. We actually take the policy-making decision away from the government, away from this independent entity that doesn't even belong to the federal government, but is actually owned by shareholders. You take that policy away, but his position was, if we're going to have the policy being made at the Federal Reserve, well, then they ought to at least be doing it right and not be doing harm, which is what they actually did in the Great Recession. So I agree 100%. I think the first step is to audit the Fed. And I think that that's something that can be accomplished, and it can be accomplished in the near future. It'll be a great stepping stone to greater reforms to getting back to a constitutional monetary system. Other questions? Yep.
I have one question, and it's kind of personal. Yeah. I think back to a few years ago, I sat in an auditorium very much like this and listened to a really, really nice man tell me everything he was going to do when he got to Washington. Well, time went on, and he took his family to Washington, and 6 months later, he was voting just like his boss. He is everybody else. And so what I want to know is, how are you going to protect you and your family from this den of thieves and liars? How do you protect yourself against that?
Have you got your tetanus shot?
That's a great question. And so she's asking, for anybody that didn't hear, how do we protect ourselves and our family from the challenges in Washington, D.C., so we don't end up getting back there and just voting just the same as everybody else that are part of the Washington establishment. And, a good friend of mine, when I announced for Congress, sent me a text, and he said, I'll be praying for your soul. And, you know, and then he waited a little bit, and he said, and I responded back with something lighthearted and said, oh, thank you, it's good to hear from you. And he responded back and said, no, I'm serious. I'm going to be praying for your soul. And I think that's the sentiment.
Believe me.
What's that?
I will be too, believe me.
Absolutely. And I think that it's critical. I mean, I pray for our leaders, that they will be inspired, that they will refer to the Constitution, defer to it, and follow it. And I appreciate those prayers, but I also appreciate the concern. I think that it is a valid concern. But I tell you, as my witness to you, is that I'm going back to Washington because I want to do everything in my power to get us back to that constitutional government that our founding fathers expected us to have. And if I'm not having an impact in moving us in that direction, I'll come home. I don't want to be in Washington. I have no desire to be there. What I want to do is make a difference in the country, make a difference in the country that our kids and our grandkids are going to be inheriting. There are significant pressures in public policy making. And I've seen it at the state level. The special interests are down there and they're working it diligently. But I've been one that stood up to those special interests, and that's what I'll do in Washington as well. And if 6 months down the road, after earning the vote of the people, you come to me and you tell me if I've not lived up to that promise, and I will come home. There's no reason for me to be in Washington, just to be another part of the problem. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah. One more question? Last one? Okay, 2 more, so here.
Are you prepared to do things that may put your life in danger? I mean, are you prepared to do things that are not popular? Are you prepared to really knock on doors and get people on your side? Get your salaries cut. There's no reason why Congress should be making more than our military. Are you prepared to go and fight to get the pensions? You serve 5 years, you got a pension for life. That's our money. Those are sacred funds that you guys have custody of. Are you prepared to do things that could put a big target on your back?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. You know, that I absolutely, and similar to the question that we just asked. Now, I mean, that's what motivates me to go to Washington. It's a sense of calling. I mean, much like someone who, like you said, are you prepared to put yourself in harm's way? I mean, we look to, there's no comparison to our troops. You know, the sacrifice that they make when they go and do put themselves in harm's way. But why do they do it? Is it because they want to go to war? No, it's because they have a sense of calling and a sense of duty. And they risk their lives. They put themselves in harm's way because they want to protect us and they want to protect the country that we all love and cherish and the freedoms that we all hold so dear. That's what I feel. That's the reason why I want to go to Washington. And I am prepared to do whatever it takes to move the direction of the debate, to not just be a vote, one vote out of 435, just occupying a chair and sending press releases back to the district, but be someone who's actually changing what's being voted on, who's in the arena, who's advocating for real change, for reducing public pensions. I fought against an expansion of public pensions that my opponent supported in the legislature this session. That's something that I will do, notwithstanding significant public pressure to increase these public pensions. That's something that I will do. I've been a supporter of term limits. You know, my opponent actually voted against a bill that was sending a message to Congress saying, let's support term limits in Congress. My opponent also voted to repeal Arizona's term limits. And when I'm talking about my opponent, as Rustin said, I'm talking about the opponent, the one that I think most of us are trying to decide between. Those are differences. That's me. That's the calling that I feel. That's the sense of duty that I feel. Some have asked, you know, why would you want to go back to D.C. when you have young children at home? And my response is, why would I not want to save the future for my kids and my young children that I do have at home? That's the calling and the sense of duty that I have. So one last question there. Yeah, there in the back.
Regarding apportionment, the U.S. Constitution, our Constitution, calls for one congressman for every 30,000, a maximum of 60,000 citizens. We're around 700,000 currently. that ratio. What are your thoughts on apportionment, and do you feel there's a way to address getting back towards constitutionally mandated apportionment?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that the Constitution had that in it for a very important purpose, and that was so that it was easy to have access to your congressman, much like your state legislator. You know, I come to this gathering regularly. I go to the legislative district meeting gatherings every month. I'm in the community. I'm going to T-ball with my friends and neighbors, and you have that ability to interact on a regular basis with your state legislator. Congressional districts are a bit bigger, and it's a little bit harder to have that access to your congressman. And so I think that was the purpose for having that apportionment. And I think that it is something that is lost as we've gone to much bigger districts. So I think that it's an interesting concept, and it's certainly something that I think would make a lot of sense to decrease the number of constituents that each congressman has so that you have more access to your congressman. I think the reason why they went away from that, obviously, is just the unwieldiness of a large public policy making body. But there are ways to cope with that and still get to that apportionment that was in the Constitution. I think that was the last question. We have time for a quick one from Task. Is it real short?
Yes.
All right.
In that vein of the apportionment, do you have any plans to do anything to work to repeal the 17th Amendment and return the choosing of the senators to the state legislatures instead of to millions of people to choose 2 people?
You know, I think that would be good policy. I think that our founding fathers established the Senate as a deliberate body that would represent the states for a reason. And that was that there was this federalism. You had the separation of powers both at the federal level and at the state level and between the federal and the state level. And so it was important that the states had representation in Congress. And when we enacted the 17th Amendment in the 19-teens, that
13.
paved the... What was it?
13.
1913. So in 1913, we enacted the 17th Amendment, and that paved the way for a significant increase in the role of the federal government, because no longer did the states have their representation saying, this might be a good policy, it's a state issue, and it should be done there. You know, I think that absolutely if there's a method to be successful in changing that balance of power, we need to pursue it. Whatever that method is. I think the most likely method of changing that balance of power is through the Amendments Convention that we talked about earlier. Well, if that's about the time that I have, I just want to wrap up saying I have really been honored to be able to represent you in the legislature. It really has been humbling to receive your support and to receive your trust in acting public policy on your behalf at the state level. I've been a conservative leader, and I ask for your support. I ask for your trust in sending me back to Congress to be someone who can be in that arena fighting for your conservative values and who will actually see the fight through to the end. That's my commitment to you, and that's my promise. If you've liked what you've heard here today, I'd encourage you to take a yard sign, display it with pride in your yard, take 5 yard signs and share some with your neighbors. Come down to our campaign headquarters. We're working the phones every day. Yesterday we hit a record and we contacted 7,000 voters in our district. And that's why we're going to win this race, is because of the grassroots efforts from volunteers like you. I would be honored to have your support. I would love to see you down at our campaign headquarters. It's on Val Vista and Brown. Stop in anytime. There's a lot of different things that you can do to help the campaign. I'd be honored to have your support. Thank you so much for having me here tonight.